So this is going to be the activity lecture for Chapter 11, where we're going to go over the answers to the Chapter 11 in-class worksheet. So first we'll start with muscle strains, Case 1. Case 1, Jessica, a 20-year-old athlete, was in a mild car accident that resulted in blunt trauma to her left shoulder. Following the accident, she noticed that her left shoulder hurt anytime she tried to raise her left arm. Answer the questions below about Jessica's injury. Number 1. Jessica's pain is the most severe when she abducts her shoulder. It also hurts to flex and hyperextend her arm, but to a lesser degree. What muscle has Jessica most likely injured from your list of 36 muscles to know? So Jessica has most likely injured her deltoid, since that is the agonist or prime mover for abduction of the shoulder, and the deltoid also plays a role in both flexion and extension of the shoulder, and Jessica's having pain with all three of these movements. Number 2, for the muscle that you identified in question 1, what is the classification of that muscle based on the arrangement of fascicles within that muscle? Describe how this arrangement allows this muscle to have multiple actions such as abduction, flexion, and extension. So the deltoid is a multipinnate muscle, meaning that the tendon branches and the fascicles come in at an angle to the tendons. So because it's multipinnate and it has multiple tendon branches, it can be divided into 3 functional regions. So I have a little image here that shows the 3 functional regions of the deltoid in 3 different colors. So the red area would be the anterior portion, the green area would be the medial portion, and the blue area would be the posterior portion. So if you contract the entire muscle, so the red, blue, and green areas in this image, or if you just contracted the medial portion shown in green, you would get abduction of the shoulder, so the arm would come out to the side away from the body. If you only contracted the anterior portion shown as the red part in this image, you would get flexion of the shoulder and medial rotation of the shoulder. And if you contracted only the posterior portion of the deltoid shown as blue in this image, you would get extension of the shoulder and lateral rotation of the shoulder. So the fact that this muscle has 3 different tendon branches is what allows you to have this wide variety of movement at the same joint. Number 3, for the muscle that you identified in question 1, how would you classify that muscle using the terminology from Chapter 11? Example, agonist, synergist, antagonist, fixator, etc. So the deltoid is an agonist for shoulder abduction. Remember, agonists are the prime movers that are mostly responsible for a certain movement. And so the deltoid is the prime muscle, the one mostly responsible for shoulder abduction. This would make the deltoid an antagonist for the opposite action, which would be shoulder adduction. So if a muscle is an agonist for a specific motion, it would be an antagonist for the opposite motion. So remember, antagonists oppose the agonist for a specific movement. So the deltoid would oppose agonists for shoulder adduction. And if you're curious, the pectoralis major and the latissimus dorsi would be the agonist for shoulder adduction that the deltoid is an antagonist for. Number 4, for the muscle that you identified in question 1, describe what type of lever system takes place at the shoulder joint when this muscle is used to move the shoulder. Identify the location of the applied force, the fulcrum, and the load. So here is a picture, sort of a stringy picture, but it still lets us get the idea of where the deltoid is located and that it is abducting the arm. So it is pulling on the humerus and abducting the arm at the shoulder joint. So first, if we identify the load would be the weight of the arm, and that's shown here with the purple arrow. The fulcrum is shown here. This would be the shoulder joint. The fulcrum is the fixed point around which we are getting movement. And then the applied force would be the pull of the deltoid, and the applied force is really being applied to the area where the muscle inserts, which in this case is on the humerus. So this is the direction of the applied force. So now that I've identified the load, the applied force, and the fulcrum, I look to see which is in the middle, and I see that the applied force is in between the load and the fulcrum. And if the applied force is in the middle, that makes this a third-class lever system. That should say lever. So this should be a third-class lever system. So I have a little memorization trick that helps me remember the difference between a first, second, and third-class lever system. So I remember Florida, FLA, because I love the beach. So if I think FLA, Florida, then I know that the letters that are an abbreviation for Florida are in order of first, second, and third. So F would be first, L would be second, A would be third. And then this way I can remember that if the fulcrum is in the middle, it's a first-class lever. If the load is in the middle, it's a second-class lever. And if the applied force is in the middle, it's a third-class lever. And so in this example, the applied force was in the middle, making this a third-class lever. Question number 5. For the muscle that you identified in question 1, indicate the points of origin and insertion. Which end of the muscle is the origin and which end is the insertion in general? So here is just a quick little picture to remind you that the origin is going to be the side of the muscle that doesn't move. The insertion is going to be on a different bone or structure usually, and it's going to be the side that is going to move. So in general, the origin is the fixed end with little to no movement. And in general, the insertion is the movable end. And if we're looking in the appendages, the origin is usually proximal and the insertion is usually distal. So if we take a look at the deltoid specifically, we can see that the origin is the clavicle and the scapula. So the deltoid is attached to both the clavicle and the scapula, and it inserts onto the humerus. So that means the humerus would be the movable end of the deltoid, and so the deltoid does move the humerus. So when you abduct your shoulder or even flex and extend it, you're actually moving the humerus around. Okay, so now we'll take a look at case 2. So case number 2, Jessica's friend Steve was also in the car accident. Due to the way Steve was facing during the crash, he sustained a whiplash injury. Whiplash occurs when a person's head is thrown backward and then forward very quickly, straining the neck's muscles and ligaments. So here's an image to help you see what happens during whiplash. So the head is rapidly thrown backwards and then forwards, and this can strain the muscles in the neck, the ligaments in the neck. If it happens rapidly and fast enough, you can even result in concussion from the brain hitting up against the inside of the skull, and we'll talk more about that in the later upcoming brain chapter. So question number 1, what is the name of the one neck muscle that you need to know for chapter 11? So there's only one neck muscle on your list of 36 muscles, and that is the sternocleidomastoid. Question 2, what is the origin and insertion of this muscle? How can the name help you to remember these? So let's take a look at a picture of an isolated sternocleidomastoid. So the origin is the clavicle and the manubrium of the sternum. So this muscle attaches to both the clavicle and the manubrium, which is the top part of the sternum. And the insertion is the mastoid process of the temporal bone. So that is that large bump that is behind your ear, and that is the mastoid process that we identified back in chapter 7, that really large bump on the temporal bone. So if I look at the name of this muscle, the sternocleidomastoid, and I break it into these 3 parts, the sterno part is another name for sternum. So that reminds me that the origin is on the sternum. Cleido is another name for the clavicle. So that reminds me that the clavicle is also part of the origin. And then the mastoid is referring to the insertion point on the mastoid process. So the name contains both parts of the origin and the insertion. So the sternocleidomastoid. Number 3, if you look at a picture of this muscle, what would you predict about the fascicle arrangement of this muscle? So here is another picture. Again, we can see that it is originating on the clavicle and the sternal, or the sternum, the manubrium, and that it is inserting on the mastoid process behind the ear. And if you notice, all of the fascicles run parallel to each other, making this a parallel muscle. And of the two shapes or types of the parallel muscles, this would be the wrapping type. So all of the fascicles are parallel to the long axis of the muscle, and this is a very strong arrangement because all of the fibers are pulling in the same direction as the tendon. So as the wrapping type, I forgot to say, is also this is the flat type of parallel muscle. So you have the type with the belly and the flat type, and this is one of the two flat types. Number 4, what are the actions of this muscle? So if you contract the left and right sternocleidomastoid muscles at the same time, you get flexion of the neck, which is like nodding your chin down to your chest. If you contract either just the left side or just the right side, this results in flexing the head toward the shoulder on the same side as the contraction. So in this particular example, this would be contraction of the left sternocleidomastoid. So the head is undergoing lateral flexion to the left side, and then the face gets rotated to the opposite side, so facing in the opposite direction as the lateral flexion. And we will finish off by looking at some miscellaneous questions. So number 1, list the remaining types of fascicle arrangements not discussed above and give an example of one of the muscles from your list of 36 that has that arrangement. So I'm going to go ahead and go over all of the fascicle arrangements again so that this can serve as a further review for you. So parallel fascicle arrangement, the fascicles are arranged parallel to the long axis of the muscle, and these can be divided into 3 broad categories. We have spindle-shaped parallel muscles that have a belly, so the middle is fatter than the ends. These may also be called fusiform muscles. Some examples of these from your list are the teres major, the triceps brachii, the biceps brachii, the brachioradialis, the biceps femoris, the semimembranosus, and the semitendinosus. You can also have flat parallel muscles. These are sometimes called wrapping muscles. They may also be called strap muscles. And some examples of these from your list are sternocleidomastoid, as we discussed before, the buccinator, the levator scapulae, the external oblique, the gluteus maximus, and the sartorius. And notice with both of these, if you look at the individual lines that represent the fascicles, they are all parallel to each other. And then the third type is a flat parallel muscle with tendinous bands. So this one is similar to the middle one, except it is broken up with tendons in the middle of the muscle. And an example of this one is the rectus abdominis. Convergent fascicle arrangement means the fascicles extend over a broad area and they come together onto a common attachment site. So this would be an example here. Your fascicles are spread over a wide area and they all come together. These often look like fan or triangle shaped muscles. So some examples from your list include the temporalis, the trapezius, the pectoralis major, and the latissimus dorsi. With a circular fascicle arrangement, the fascicles are concentrically arranged around an opening. And so when this type of muscle contracts, the opening will narrow or get smaller. Examples of this type from your list are the orbicularis oculi and the orbicularis oris. And then the final type are the pinnate muscles. In these, the fascicles form an angle with the tendon. So there are 3 major types of pinnate muscles. With a unipinnate muscle, the fascicles form an angle on only one side of the tendon. So if you look at the dotted black lines, those represent the fascicles, and you can see they come in and they actually form an angle with the tendon. They're not parallel with the tendon like in the parallel muscles. A lot of textbooks use this type of drawing to describe the unipinnate muscles, but in reality, muscles have tendons on both sides for the origin and in the insertion, so they actually look more like this. So the white area is the tendon, as you can see at the top and the bottom. But again, even though we've got a tendon at the top and the bottom, this is still a unipinnate because the fascicles are coming in at an angle to only one side of each of the tendons. So notice it's only on one side. So that is a unipinnate muscle. Examples from your list include the extensor digitorum, the gracilis, and the vastus lateralis. Then we also have bipinnate fascicle arrangement, in which the fascicles come in at an angle on both sides of the tendon. So again, you can see the dotted black lines to show the angle that is coming into the tendon. And again, this is kind of cutting the muscle off. So if we look at it like a complete bipinnate muscle, it would look more like this. It might have a fusiform appearance at first, but the difference between this one and the fusiform is the fusiform, the fibers are all parallel throughout the entire muscle, whereas in this one, they are again coming in at an angle to the tendon, and it's on both sides. So examples of bipinnate muscles from your list include the flexor carpi ulnaris, the extensor carpi ulnaris, the rectus femoris, and the tibialis anterior. And then we have multipinnate fascicle arrangement, in which a muscle has a tendon, a single tendon, that branches into multiple tendon branches, and the fascicle fibers are coming in at an angle to these separate tendons. And again, it kind of looks more like this in reality, where you have a tendon that branches into multiple other tendons, and the fibers come in at an angle to each of these tendons. Examples of multipinnate muscles include the masseter and the deltoid. So question number 2, look at the picture given. What type of lever system does this represent? So sorry for the bad image that I provided to you, but this is actually an example of a triceps extension, an overhead triceps extension. So you might have done these in the gym where you have some sort of a weight, you lower it behind your head, and then you re-straighten your arm. So when we're straightening the arm, that is the triceps extension. So if we look at this picture and compare it to this picture, the load is caused by the weight that's in my hand. The fulcrum is going to be my elbow. That's the fixed point around which movement occurs. And the applied force is the pull of the triceps that is used to straighten the elbow. All right, so if we look at the 3 parts of this lever, we have the applied force, the fulcrum, and the load. We can see that the fulcrum is in the middle, and that makes this a first-class lever system. So remember my little memorization trick that I went over earlier. If you think about lovely Florida and all of its beaches, think FLA, that's the old abbreviation for Florida, and the letters are in the order first, second, third. So if the fulcrum is in the middle, it's a first class. If the load is in the middle, it's a second class. And if the applied force is in the middle, it's a third class. Number 3, from your list of 36 muscles, indicate a muscle that could be an agonist for knee extension, but an antagonist for knee flexion. So the agonist for knee extension, and thus the antagonist for knee flexion, would include any of the quadriceps femoris group. So you could have put any of these 4 muscles, the rectus femoris, the vastus lateralis, the vastus medialis, or the vastus intermedius. And just to note, and as a point to help you with your learning, the hamstrings, which are made up of the biceps femoris, semitendinosus, and semimembranosus, would be the opposite. They would be agonist for knee flexion and antagonist for knee extension. Number 4, from your list of 36 muscles, indicate a muscle that could be an agonist for hip extension, but an antagonist for hip flexion. So there's only one muscle on your list that fits this description, and that would be the gluteus maximus. So the gluteus maximus is the prime mover for hip extension. So if you do like hip extension exercises like is shown in this image here, the gluteus maximus is going to be your prime mover or your agonist. The hamstrings do help out, but they're more of a synergistic role. And again, just for your information, if you're curious about the prime mover for hip flexion, that would be the iliacus and the psoas major, which were not on your list, but that's just for your information. And that is the end of the Chapter 11 activity.